going to wait for people to comment on it. If nobody is passing any comments, most probably I'll be reading a book. So, well, so I request you guys to to this quantitative problem of sources originating in Iran itself, we must add some qualitative ones. The Iranians, unlike the Greeks who possessed a propensity for recording factual data and a searching curiosity about peoples and places, were more interested in either declamatory statements, such as we find in the text of the inscriptions, or the rhetorical rendering of events embellished like works of literature and entertainment. This was the tradition which was followed in the redaction of Qadai-Namak, a mixture of legendary and authentic history of the Iranian nation, compiled in late Sasanian times. It is well reflected also in Firdausi's Shahnama, which is ultimately based on the Sasanian compilation. Great as the Shahnama is as an epic, it leaves many questions of substance and detail unanswered that perhaps more prosaic historians with the training and method of Herodotus, Pliny, or Procopius would have clarified. Iranian historiography, as seen through Arabic and Persian renderings, is often selective, impressionistic, and anecdotal, making use of conventional themes, floating motifs, typical scenes, recurrent descriptions, and fixed epithets. Historical works were often meant to move more than to inform. They belong to a tradition with its own particular norms and purposes, and therefore are not ideal tools to serve analytical history as understood in the West. Another qualitative problem arises from the aristocratic nature of Iranian historiography. In Parthian and Sasanian times, the written word was largely the domain of the scribal class and the priests. We know little about the recording of history in Parthian times, and no historical works are attributed to that epoch. In the Sasanian period, the scribes and priests shared the same ideology and were united in support of a regime which found its fullest expression in the authority of the King of Kings. Any record of secular events was generally, it seems, either sponsored or controlled by the courts of kings and nobles. We know of official records of royal deeds and pronouncements kept at the Sasanian court. Needless to say, such records tended to enhance the image of the king and to support official policies. Registering the royal enthronement speeches, successes in war, the founding of cities or fire temples, and reports of the king's official deeds to have constituted the bulk of such records. These were accessible to the high-ranking scribes at court, who could make use of them, but again only in a manner which would not be at variance with the wishes and policies of the reigning monarch. Many blanks in the native historical traditions would appear to be the result of suppression of unsavory, displeasing, or embarrassing records. That is probably why we do not hear much of any schisms in the long history of Mazdaeasnian religion. Above all, that is why the history of the Assassins is reduced in the Sasanian tradition almost to nothing. The complete disappearance of Kartir, the formidable architect of Sasanian state religion, from later records may be due to the animosity of Narsen, whose earlier attempts at succession Kartir had apparently failed to endorse. In general, Sasanian historical tradition served the ideals and interests of nobles and priests. As the basis of Iranian polity, their ideals and interests sometimes even overrode the whims or private policies of individual kings. In numerous instances, we see that the kings are restricted or manipulated by an alliance of the nobles or the nomarchs or both. The conditions for succession presented by representatives of the two classes to Bahram V is a case in point. The state of written records in Iran being what it is, archaeological finds, coins, inscriptions, rock reliefs, ostraca, papyri, graffiti, and architectural remains from the period assume special importance. But it is to classical writers that we are chiefly indebted for their enlightening reports on the events in Iran. Valuable as such reports are, however, one cannot expect them to be balanced or free of bias since they derive from countries inimical to us and often at war with Iran. Classical writers were naturally less well informed about the conditions and events in eastern Iran, but even about western Iran, the information they furnish is selective and deficient in understanding of Iranian culture and society. Still more partial are Syrian and Armenian writers whose co-religionists were often persecuted by the Iranians and whose bias is generally caused by the difference of faith. We depend chiefly on coins and archaeological evidence the little we know about the history of eastern Iran and Transoxiana. In order to arrive at a fairly coherent history of the period, therefore, we often have to resort to reconstructions and to make assumptions based on such meager material as our sources provide. In view of the conservatism of Iranian institutions, the method of retrospection and projection often proves helpful in this endeavor. For instance, we feel entitled to deduce from the court etiquette in Islamic times procedures pertaining to the Sasanian era or to derive information about the rules of succession among the Assassins from political and legal information we have about the Sasanians. Further, we may project the Achaemenid social estates or the temple cult of images into Parthian times. It is only by culling information from widely diverse sources and by making judicious use of imagination and speculation that the challenge of writing a recent history of the period can be met. The Greek presence in Iran. In less than 10 years, Alexander and his army overthrew an imperial system and crushed an international bureaucratic machine which had been in operation for over 200 years. The burning down of the royal palaces at Persepolis. Why were they burned down? The burning down of the royal palaces at Persepolis symbolized the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. We have no record of how the Iranians felt and what consternation they experienced when the towering structure of the Achaemenid state crumbled and the people who had been the masters of the world became overnight subjected to foreign rule. One can only guess at the bewilderment and profound distress that the rout of the Persian army, the fall of the royal house, and the emergence of the Greeks as masters must have caused in the heartland of Iran. A faint echo of the people's dismay and the priests' outrage is found in the Zoroastrian Pahlavi literature, which remembers the accursed Gijastak Alexander as the destroyer of fire temples, the burner of the holy scriptures, and the murderer of the Magi. The early Sasanian propaganda portrayed him as the annihilator of Iran's unity and power, the originator of the petty king system, Karak Swadhai, and the author of many wars for Iran. The new masters, although familiar to the Persians through long periods of Greco-Iranian association, war, trade, and travel, were ethnically different, did not speak an Iranian language, practiced a different religion, and held a different concept of government from that of the Iranians. But unlike the barbarian invaders from the northeast, the Greeks had a brilliant culture with advanced techniques in military operations, art, and architecture, not to mention a system of government, many aspects of which fair-minded Iranians could envy. Their impact was one of far-reaching dimensions. It is seen at work during the Hellenistic period in Iran, which extends roughly from the foundation of the Seleucid dynasty almost to the end of the Parthian period. And in some respects a little beyond. This impact, however, produced in Iran a result different from that in Syria, Asia Minor, and Egypt. Hellenism in these countries had a full flowering and spread a new form of culture. In Iran, it remained only an influence, albeit a strong one. In other words, Iran did not lose its basic identity and did not abandon its own cultural traits embodied above all in its religion. Its assertion, it soon attempted to pull away from the West, aspiring towards a self-assertion which culminated in the proud Sasanian nationalism and the exclusiveness of the Zoroastrian Church. Alexander founded or renamed a number of Alexandrias, and the Seleucids and the Greco-Bactrian kings proceeded to establish Okay, two people watching, nobody commenting. Okay, guys, if you have any comments, you can make. I'm always willing to listen to people and try to answer them. Alexander founded or renamed a number of Alexandrias, and the Seleucids proceeded to establish other Greek cities stretching from northwestern India and the shores of the Oxus to Asia Minor. Those cities in which Greek and Macedonian citizens lived were self-governing entities, polis with their own with their own councils and assemblies, military defense and finances, religious and athletic centers. Some Iranian cities and towns were granted a status which approximated that of a polis, namely politeuma. Once the Achaemenian establishment vanished, the polis became the model of urban living, attracting the Iranian elite. It was from the polis that Greek culture emanated and the Greek language made its impact. In the course of a few decades, the higher strata of Iranian society adopted much of Greek customs and procedures. Thus, when the first Parthian king rose to power, his coins were struck after Seleucid models and imprinted with Greek legend, as were those of King Hyknappus of Elymais about 162 BC and King Hyspaosines of Characene about 125 BC. In 141 BC, Mithridates I used the epithet Philhellene, lover of the Greeks, in order to please and attract Greek inhabitants of the newly conquered territories. This epithet continued on Parthian coins to the end of the dynasty. The coins that Mithridates struck in Ecbatana bear the galloping diaspori on the reverse. Mithridates' son, Phraates, in imitation of the Seleucid kings who had assumed divine status, styled himself on the coins Theopateros of divine descent. As a result of Greek supremacy, the Greek language was studied by Iranian bureaucrats and those with political aspirations, and Greek literature was cultivated. It has often been repeated that when news of the crushing victory of the Parthian army at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC and the ignominious defeat and death of the Roman general Crassus was brought to Orodes, he and his court were being entertained by the Armenian king with the performance of Eurydice Bacchae. Among the rare written documents from the Parthian period are three parchments relating to the sale of the same vineyard. Of these, two dated 88 or 87 and 2221 BC are in Greek, the third in Parthian, which shows the currency of Greek and its validity in quotes. Even in the 3rd century AD, when Shapur I wanted to record his victories over the Romans, he used in his renowned inscription in the Kabai Zardusht not only Middle Persian and Parthian, but also Greek. Such was the prestige of the language some 400 years after the Seleucids had been driven out of Iran. The Greek script was not only used for Greek itself but was adopted in eastern Iran by the Bactrians to render their Iranian language. And later, when the Kushans conquered Bactria, they adopted both the Bactrian language and the Greek alphabet, as is seen in their lapidary inscriptions and on their coins. Indications of Greek influence can be seen in a number of other fields as well. Drachma, Persian dirham, and denarius, Persian dinar, were adopted as the basic denominations of currency. Some designations of weight and measures were borrowed from the Greek, as is seen in Middle Persian stare and in the division of the whole into six equal parts, Persian dang. The words for silver, seen, and for a good many precious stones, diamond, emerald, pearl, ruby in Persian, are derived from the Greek, and this suggests the value placed by the people not only on Greek jewelry and its craftsmanship, but also on the polis at the center of high life and fashion. The Greek presence was felt even in the religious sphere. Greek temples and statues could be seen in Greek cities from Punjab to Asia Minor, from Zaksatas to the island of Karg in the Persian Gulf. We may recall that the cult of images and icons was promoted by Artaxerxes II, who ruled from 404 to 359 BC, who, according to Berosus, the Babylonian priestly scholar writing in early 3rd century BC, was the first to introduce the image cult of Aphrodite Anitis in the chief cities of the empire. Although such innovation may possibly have shocked the Puritan Zoroastrian priests who considered only the imageless cult of fire altars appropriate, nonetheless the king's example was followed. This development seems facilitated by the familiarity of the Iranians in major centers like Sardis, Susa, and Babylon, all centers of non Iranian cultures with the cult of foreign deities such as Nanai, Ishtar, or Saibi, Shamash, and Nabu, who they could identify with Anahita, Mitra, and Tishriya, respectively. One might surmise that Cyrus' veneration of the gods of his conquered lands and his seeking of their blessings was understood by his own entourage as a diplomatic gesture in the light of such identifications. Identification of foreign gods with Iranian deities, therefore, did not represent an entirely new process, but under the impact of Hellenism, it took on a new dimension, and now the Iranian elite could conceive Zeus as comparable to Ahura Mazda, Apollo or Hermes to Mitra, Hera, Aphrodite or Artemis to Anahita, Hades to Ahriman, and Heracles to Venetragna. Vahran Bahram. Thus, on the coins of the Assassins and the kings of Elymais and Characene, as well as those struck in eastern regions, we frequently find the figure of Nike, Heracles, Apollo, or Tyche, which to Iranians must have meant the deities Vanand, Veretragna, Mitra, and Swarena. Had religious monuments been preserved from the Seleucid period in western and east central Iran, we would probably have found examples similar to those of Antiochus I of Commagene, which are dedicated to the cult of Zeus or Mazdas, Apollo, Mitra, Helios, Heracles, Artemis, Vahran, Ares, along with the cult of himself and that of his country. Perhaps nowhere is the impact of Hellenism more clearly seen than in the field of art. Achaemenid art was the culmination of the art of the ancient Near East. It was deliberately eclectic, borrowing elements from the neighboring nations, and yet thorough through an imaginative combination and harmonious synthesis. It succeeded in creating some of the finest examples of ancient Near Eastern art, both minor and monumental. Ultimately, it was inspired by a vision of a unified and harmonious world ruled by the imperial power. Greek art and its underlying concepts were different. Quote, whereas at Susa and Persepolis, writes Daniel Schlumberger, traditions sometimes going back 2.5 millennia into the past result in this ultimate effort towards perfection, which freezes them into immutability. At that very time, on the banks of the Aegean Sea, they developed an art interested in movement, always in quest of progress, never satisfied with the results achieved, and engaged in a constant effort to outdo itself. This art, modern art to the Iranians, was now to be seen in Greek temples, theatres, gymnasia, and the complexes of administrative buildings in the polis, as well as in Greek artifacts. It presented a different vision, a delight in human forms, in movement, and in postures born of balanced tension. Backed by the power and prestige of the conquerors, the new art became fashionable and threw many of the premises and ideals of Achaemenid art into disuse. Although little Hellenistic art has survived in Iran itself, the few examples which have been preserved in Iran, example at Nisa, and those which have survived outside Iran at Hatra, Dura, Assur, Palmyra, as well as in Afghanistan and northwestern India, show vast concessions to Greek art. What was made by the Greeks for their own use, the recently discovered and excavated buildings of Greek city at Iconium in Bactria, for example, is not as interesting for our purposes as the art produced by or for the Iranians under Greek influence, particularly in the post-Seleucid periods. The complex of buildings found at Nisa, the first capital of the Asacids, is a case in point. Here, though the architecture appears to be essentially native with some Achaemenid elements, the terracotta ornaments of the buildings attest to the provenance of Hellenized art. The same is true of the wall paintings and panel stuccos found at Kuhi Khwaja in Sistan, the great temple of Artemis Anahita at Gangawar, the Kushal monuments at Surkotar north of the Hindu Kush, or the Buddhist art of Gandhara, in all of which the Greek and native elements have combined to varying degrees. However, we would be wrong if we left off the story here because its conclusion is quite different from what one may have been led to expect. Hellenism, which had been superimposed on latent national tendencies, was cast off in a movement initiated by the Parthians and carried out by the Sasanians. The reassertion of Iranian traditions. I have lingered on Hellenism in Iran and the instances of its influence precisely because its effects were largely transient in the long run, and the spirit and outlook of Greek culture, which nourished Western civilization many centuries later, proved in the end alien to and incompatible with the Iranian way of life. So complete was this reversion that one can easily lose sight of the fact that Iran went through a period of Greek and Macedonian ascendancy when the secular elite went out of their way to adopt Greek customs and culture. The reaction against Greek culture naturally did not start suddenly. We know next to nothing as far as documentary evidence goes about how the Iranians organized their life during the Seleucid period. Considering, however, the benign indifference of the Seleucids to other either Hellenizing or converting their Iranian subjects, and taking later events into account, we are entitled to assume, as a working hypothesis, that in the rural districts and townships, an indigenous mode of life continued, unaffected by the Greek presence. Similar to India under the British, I guess. India under the British was also the very same where, and once the British vacated, India reverted back to its old self. A distinction must be made between the image of Iran evoked by the Achaemenid state with its several capitals at Persepolis, Susa, Babylon, and Ecbatana, its sumptuous palaces and its huge army, and that of Iran under Greek domination. Achaemenid Iran was a superpower led by the Persians but maintained and fortified by the financial, military, and technical resources of many nations. Seleucid Iran was a more limited entity shorn of the huge resources that Achaemenid power and wealth bestowed on it. When the Seleucids moved their capital to Antioch in Syria and concentrated on their western possessions, it was no doubt partly because of the limited benefits accruing from the Iranian satrapies. Defeated but not despondent, many Iranians must have led a sullen existence under the Seleucids, resenting the loss of wealth and prestige for their people and awaiting a savior to restore them to their once glorious days. To this period, we must assign the expansion of apocalyptic literature in Iran, which looked for the appearance of the social to punish the wicked and effect the renovation of the world. The chief surviving work of this genre, the Zandi Vahman Yasht, goes back, as its name implies, to an Avestan original which predated Parthian rule. Literature of protest and apocalyptic prophecies of the same kind were produced in other parts of the Middle East under Greek domination, and the folk histories of local and national heroes were elaborated and enhanced as a reaction to the alien rule. Thus, while the westernized elite fell in with the Greek way of life, a silent but hopeful majority followed its traditional bent. It was this majority whose cause was championed by some assassins and more forcefully by the Sasanians, which eventually triumphed. The existence of simmering discontent among the Iranians and their resentment against alien domination may be seen in some flickers of evidence from Parthian times. Already in the coinage of Arsaces I, which otherwise follows the Seleucid model, signs of an ethnic nationalism emerge. On the reverse of his coins, instead of the common Seleucid motif of Apollo seated on the omphalos and holding a bow, we find an archer in steppe dress seated on a stool and holding a bow. Also, on some of his coins, part of the Greek legend is replaced by a word in Aramaic script. Again, the headgear consists of a satrapal bashlik, familiar from the coins struck in Achaemenid times. In Persis, where the tradition of the Achaemenians was better remembered and the Macedonian supervision weak, the coins of the local rulers continue many Achaemenian features. These include the use of Aramaic script, a throned king on the reverse, Baghdad's coins, and the king standing before a tower altar with three fires, Oborzos coins. More revealing, however, is the evidence of the Astraka dating from the 1st century BC found at Nisa. They contain records of deliveries of wine and other commodities to the royal storehouse, possible as revenue to maintain name fires for the blessing of the souls of early Assassid kings. The names of persons, example, Ohurmazdik, Atwahista, Faharenbug, Dain Mazdak, and places, as well as the unmistakable use of the Zoroastrian calendar, Avestan month and day names attest to the Zoroastrian faith of the people and their Parthian kings. They testify to the insistence of the Parthians on retaining their traditional religious calendar and alphabet in the place of Seleucid calendar and Greek script. The occurrence of two Iranian terms on the Nisa Ostraka, Migwas, priest, magus, and Arthwasp, master of the fire, confirms this conclusion, as does the use of the Zoroastrian calendar on the Parthian document from Avraman. The Nisa documents lend support to the view that in the countryside and among the conservative landed gentry, the Dehegans, the Zoroastrian piety continued practically undisturbed by the new order. The priestly class, whose outrage at Alexander's conquest we have already mentioned, must have been, together with the Dehegan class, the chief custodians of Iranian traditions in the face of the Hellenistic wave. Monumental, mostly lapidary inscriptions used the Aramaic script and Aramaic scribes in their chanceries for epistolary communication. The scribes who took dictation in the language of their letter reached destination, a scribe would read it to its employer mentally translating it into his employer's language and pronouncing it as such, say in Persian, Median, or Egyptian. Thus, Aramaic grained eventually developed their own variation of the Aramaic alphabet. In the course of this development, a number of Aramaic words were frozen into ideograms, and important provinces came to possess a writing system in which phonetic and ideographic representations were combined. Such a system developed in Persis, Media, Parthia, Sogdiana, Chorasmia, and possibly elsewhere. Only in Bactria, which was governed by Greek rulers, did Aramaic writing give way to Greek. Aramaic script, although an immense improvement upon cuneiform writing, is not entirely Iranian, which belongs to the Indo-European linguistic family, whereas the Greek alphabet offers alternative. Iranian provinces adhered tenaciously to their traditional way of writing. When Mithridates I conquered Babylon, he needed the talent of the educated people in Greek cities and Greek oriented communities of the western provinces to administer a considerably expanded territory. He befriended the Greek elements and called himself lover of the Greeks on his coins. Once the Abbasid hold became secure, however, we notice signs of weakening in this dependence. The Greek legends become perfunctory and less. Parthian king Vologases, probably Vologases IV, ordered the collection and preservation of all the Western texts and their commentary, the Zan, which had survived Alexander's onslaught. Thus, his attention to religious worship is mentioned by Tacitus in Annals 1213. He publicly reviled Mithridates as a Roman puppet. Gothazes and several of his descendants figure in a short Assassid kings while ignoring many famous Assassids mentioned by the Roman historians. The same group, Gothas, Geef, Bijan, are remembered in the national epic as stalwart warrior nobles who defend the integrity of Iranian land, acted with a staunch backing of Iranian causes and traditions against some westernized Assassins of Media and Mesopotamia. The proverbial antagonism of the Razis and the Marwazis may well go back to the rivalry and divergence of points of view between the more traditional Razis of the. To support this, we have the further evidence of the heroic cycles which developed in Parthian times. True, no Parthian poetry or work of literature survived came to be known as the Iranian national epic, which had its origin in Kayanian heroic poetry, was enriched, elaborated, and transmitted in the Parthian period. With the advance of the Parthian armies against the Seleucids and the consolidation of Sassanid power, the proud epics of the East spread to the other times and committed to writing. The compilation, known as the Qadai Namak, became the basis of Firdausi's Shahnama with its Zoroastrian elements greatly reduced. The legends of this national history, which are the most important literary heritages of pre-Islamic Iran, provide us with an undated but unmistakable record of Iranian sentiment, a true expression of the persevering Iranian spirit and ideology. We may now consider the problems of the political ideology, religious direction, and artistic tendencies of the period in the light of the above premises. It will be seen that in all those fields too, a movement away from Greek influence and towards self-assertion is noticeable. Okay, let's see whether anybody. Nobody has no comments. political and religious ideology. The Seleucids, who had won their vast empire by force of arms, naturally exploited it. They levied taxes and troops from provinces and allotted land to Greek cities for their maintenance. They counted heavily on the support of their Greek subjects, for whom they cared most. Their power depended essentially on the goodwill of their subjects and thus was not institutional but personal. With, with the accession of the Arsacids, the traditional type of monarchy was renewed. A monarchy which based its legitimacy initially on its blood tie with the royal Achaemenian house. The Arsacid kings, like their Sasanian successors, proclaimed their authority not on the basis of their subjects' goodwill, but as bestowed by the supreme deity, whom in a sense they represented on earth. Thus, their authority was institutional, not personal. In practice, of course, both the Seleucids and the Parthians gained their kingdoms by the sword. The ideologies behind their power, however, were different. Iran, as elsewhere in the Middle East, power was conceived as being granted from above. God appointed both the prophets and the kings, and in both cases, the people's consent was ideologically irrelevant. Greece, in its classical era, produced no prophets and no great kings. In Western Asia, on the other hand, these were the chief instruments for regularizing social and political life. From various indications by classical authors in particular, we learn of the great authority of the Parthian king of kings and the high esteem in which he was held by his people. Some of the Arsacid kings called themselves of divine descent, a title also used by early Sasanian kings. Mzdishnbegi, Manvachitre, Manyazdan, Mazda worshipping Lord of the race of gods, which, if taken literally, is somehow out of place in Iran. Considering the silence of the Perso Arab and classical historians on any claim by Iranian kings to divinity, and judging by the text of Shapur I's great inscription at Kabai Zardusht, one is led to believe that the title was rather a conventional one inherited from the Seleucids with no real intent of demanding worship. Bhag, God, Lord, as its later semantic development into a man of rank indicates, may already have lost its exclusively divine value by the end of Achaemenian times. Even if such titles were no more than conventions in terms of veneration. In the Iranian patriarchal society, the authority of the heads of agnatic groups partook of and symbolized the exalted status of the ancestors. The king's authority not only in his own clan but also among his people to whom he represented an important father figure derived partly from an ingrained attitude which assigned sweeping powers to the head of the family and which found expression in Zoroastrian family law. Shapur the First demonstrates this typical veneration of the patriarchs by instituting, as he describes it in his great inscription, fires for the benefit of the souls of his father Ardashir and his grandfather Papak, as well as for the souls of their kin and courtiers. We seem to have another example of this filial piety in the temples at Nisa, which apparently were founded by Parthian kings for the blessing of the souls of past kings. It was the inviolate status of the royal person and the pervasive ideology of his boundless authority that helped keep the Arsacids and later the Sasanians on the throne for so long and through so much turbulence. The Shahnama, although composed during the ascendancy of the caliphs, true to its origin, gives a genuine expression to the exalted conception of kingship in pre Islamic Iran. Religious nationalism. Although Ardashir and his son Shapur may not have had a compelling religious policy, the rise of the Sasanians' power was not without a religious aspect. The latent forces which brought down the Assassins also paved the way for the growth of an organized church and the imposition of a strict religious uniformity. It was not the kings, though, who initiated this religious development, but rather the priests with the eventual support of Sasanian rulers. As the Sasanians strove towards centralization, so also did the church. In a sense, the power of the King of Kings and that of the Mobad are two expressions of the same tendency, two dimensions of the same phenomenon. Ardashir's connection with the temple of Anahita in Stakhar ought not to mislead us into believing that in Ardashir we had a priest king or that the Sasanian state began as a theocracy. The temple connection appears to have been one of sponsorship or of the administration of finances, similar to the office of a mutawalli in Islamic times, rather than an actual priesthood. The real champion of organizing the church into a coherent system with political power and a firm grip over the spiritual and temporal life of the Zoroastrians was the priest Kartir, presumably following in the footsteps of Tansar, the chief priest under Ardashir. This extraordinary personality acquired enough power to have four fairly long rock carved inscriptions associated with royal monuments. Three of them at Naqsh-e-Rustam on rock and on Kaaba, and at Sar Mashhad, repeating the same text, tell of his steady advance from the rank of Hairpat Kaaba line third under Shapur I to the highest dignity under Bahram II, including the rank of the Lord Plekshi of the temple of Anahit Ardashir in Stakht, a title borne until then only by Sasanian kings. He also describes the measures he took to ensure the purity of the Mazdayasnian religion and the observance of its precepts. The second inscription describes a spiritual journey that Kartir makes to the beyond, emulating that of Arda Viraz and foreshadowing that of Dante. He encounters his alter ego, Dane, and ascertains the existence of heaven and hell to reward righteousness and punish deceit. As a result of the measures that Kartir took to enforce his doctrine, according to him, the Mazdayasnian religion prospered. Hormuzd and the Yazad's gods were properly served, water, fire, and cattle were satisfied, the Magi thrived, fire temples were established throughout the realm. Ahriman and demons were struck down and their teachings proscribed. The believers of other religions, namely Jews, Buddhists, Shmini or Shamani, Brahmins, Sabians, Nashli, Christians, Baptists, Muktaki, and Zandiks were persecuted, and many who had deviated from the straight path were returned to the faith. While Kartir's successive ecclesiastical titles indicate the growth of a church organization, his confident and zealous assertion of orthodoxy demonstrates, even more than Ardashir's insurgents, a manifestation of genuine Iranian attitudes and sentiments and the culmination of an anti alien movement which had its beginnings already under the Seleucids. What kind of religious reform did Kartir introduce, and what were the heresies and doctrinal degenerations that he combated with such ardor? Who were the heterodox who were chastised? A satisfactory answer to all these questions is not available, given the amount of information at hand, but it can be said that Kartis was an iconoclastic movement with an exclusive view of religious truth, which aimed at restoring the Mazdayasnian religion to what he considered to be its original purity, with emphasis on the promotion of the cults of fire and water and the care of the cattle. He strove to focus religious worship around five temples served by disciplined magi. He considered all deviation from the official church views as hostile and demonic and was as suspicious and intolerant of other religions. The authoritarianism, centralism, and exclusiveness of the Sasanian Church was a vigorous expression of the same tendencies that made the rise of the Sasanians to power possible. The arts. This return to an Iranian mode of life and thought, which we have explored above, in the domains of political and religious ideology, can be seen as well in the development of art. We have noted already that examples of Parthian art are to be found mostly on the fringes of the Iranian plateau, more particularly in Iraq and Syria. By looking at this art, for instance, at Dura Europos, we see instantly that it is different in concept and treatment from Greek art. We find no attempt at rendering the human or animal anatomy in a plastic fashion, but instead a linear configuration of the body with almost no interest in fleshing it out. Rostovtsev, in his extensive discussion of Parthian art, advanced the view that the reaction against the Greek fashion in art began first in Parthia and spread with the growing power of the Arsacids to the Syro-Mesopotamian regions, Dura, Assur, Hatra, Palmyra, the Anatolian provinces, Commagene, Cappadocia, Pontus, northwestern India and Afghanistan, Gandharan art, and the Greek cities of South Russia. This movement also exerted an influence on the art of the Han dynasty in China and led at length to the creation of a polychrome style which became the ornamental style of Central and Western Europe for many centuries. The Gothic or Merovingian style. Further, according to Rostovtsev, the Sarmatians of South Russia, being influenced by Parthian art, affected to a certain extent the development of Roman provincial art. Gishman, echoing the same opinion, writes that under the Parthians, Iran breaks free from Hellenism and imposes its artistic conceptions on a large area of the Eastern world, from the Euphrates to China, from Siberia to India, from the highlands of Mongolia to the Bosphorus. Furthermore, that widespread diffusion of Iranian costume and Iranian personal adornments, Surkothal, Gandhara, Mathura, points to the existence of a koine, an artistic lingua franca, among the peoples of the East during the Parthian supremacy. Rostovtsev distinguishes several features which characterized Parthian art as seen on Parthian monuments in Iran and the Syro-Mesopotamian plains. Chief among these is the frontality of human and animal figures. Others are linearity of contour, painstaking depiction of details of dress, ornament, furniture, and ethnic characteristics, Oriental verismus. Spirituality, in that the faces and features of gods or holy personages are made to appear celestial and ethereal, even without the help of a halo or radiant crown. Repetition of the same figures with rigid ritual poses and expressions in the depiction of ceremonial and conventional scenes, and finally in the scenes of hunt, combat, or chase, portrayal of figures on horses at a flying gallop. Some art historians would not go quite as far as Rostrovtsev in counting all the above features as innovations attributable to Parthian art. Even if one should not agree entirely with the scope of influence attributed to Parthian art, it is evident that during the Parthian epoch, there developed an art in Irano-Mesopotamian regions which, while it still displayed elements of Greek art, was based on native traditions and followed different principles from Greek art. The native art of these regions did not die with the appearance of Greek art in Western Asia, but continued to exist in the hands of the local craftsmen and artists, while borrowing some elements, motifs, and stylistic features of the Greek art. In Iran, this was not the imperial art of the Achaemenians, an eclectic art which resulted from international cooperation and symbolized a supranational power, but a more genuine indigenous art inherited from the past, oriental in concept and execution, and intelligible to the local population. When the Parthians reached the western provinces of their empire, they found an art which had blended the features of local Greek and Achaemenian art. Later, an art form which was more Iranian and Central Asian in concept and style, with fewer and diminishing Greek influences, developed and spread. This occurred after the Parthians were well established, and particularly after their defeat of Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae and their advance towards Syria and Anatolia. The center of diffusion for this art, which Rostrovtsev calls the Renaissance of Iranian art under the Parthians, must have been the Parthian capital in Mesopotamia. As the Greek cities became more and more orientalized and absorbed by their grand geographical environment, they too gradually adopted the native art style and contributed to it. With the Sasanians, the monumental character of their art is best exemplified in the rock reliefs of the early kings. These reliefs, celebrating as they do the triumphs of Sasanian monarchs over their enemies and the investiture of kingship in them by Iranian gods, reflect the pride and majesty of a new and powerful dynasty. The relative abundance and exuberance of early Sasanian royal sculptures in the face of the paucity of the same kind of art from the Parthian period may create the impression of a renaissance of Persian art under the Sasanians. As Rostrovtsev pointed out long ago, this is only a myth. The backbone of it, that is Sasanian art, was the Parthian art, and it was through Parthia that the Sasanians acquired and adopted some of the leading features of Persian Achaemenian art. However, one cannot deny that there is such intensity of purpose and vigor of presentation in the early Sasanian art that it creates the impression of an entirely new art. The first phase of this art, that of the 3rd century, still exhibits some of the Greek elements present in Parthian art, but such elements are progressively eliminated so that in the art of the 6th and 7th centuries, hardly any is left. Like Parthian art, Sasanian art adheres to the principle of frontality, although not so exclusively, and continues with realistic details. In addition to reproducing graphic scenes objectively observed, Sasanian imperial art supports dynastic purposes and intentions. Scenes of the king overcoming his enemy in single combat symbolize his power, even though he may never have fought such a battle. The rendering of defeated enemies in smaller scale than the victorious monarch, of course, signifies their lower and abject status. The scenes of royal hunt, banquet, enthronement, and the like whether in rock reliefs, silver vessels, or painting, are all intended to glorify a king or a dignitary, thus conforming to the political ideology of the Sasanian state. In the field of literary arts, it is noteworthy that although Greek literature was enjoyed by the westernized Parthian nobility and at court, the Greek literary genres, which did not have an Iranian counterpart, notably drama, never took root in Iran. The Iranians continued with their own brand of epic, lyric, and didactic literature. No other field better demonstrates, perhaps, that Greek culture remained essentially alien to the Iranian spirit. Okay, nobody is watching, but four people have given their likes, and I guess I have to close this live over here. I'm quite tired.